Welcome back, guys. It's time to talk a little bit about money and banking here in the United States. We're moving into chapter 10. You have the entire PowerPoint presentation, but we're only going to do about half of it today as we talk about specifics of currency and what gives it value. The three functions of money from your textbook that you need to be familiar with are basic definitions of how we want money to play its role. In terms of a medium of exchange, that's a phrase that economists typically use to talk about facilitating trade, right? Rather than using a barter system or a system that uses gold coins or silver bullion, we really want to use something that's faster, that's easier, something that maybe even be digital so that we don't actually have to have the bills in our hand. And that's what our modern or contemporary money system does. Medium of exchange simply refers to money's function to facilitate trade and make things easier for us in U.S. markets. As a unit of measure, we expect money to be kind of like a communication device between the seller and the buyer. Putting a dollar amount with a number behind it means that both parties understand what the value of that transaction is going to be. And they can make better decisions if they understand how to use that appropriately as a unit of measure. It's a way to communicate. As a store of value, obviously money needs to retain its value over the long haul. Most of us will earn income, but we don't plan to spend all of that income right now. And if we're doing this right and managing our nation's money supply the right way, then in future months, we'll be able to rely on that earned income and expect that it will buy about the same amount of goods and services that we expected when we earned it in the first place. This is probably the weakest part of our nation's money supply in terms of it holding its value over time. That value is affected by decisions made by the Federal Reserve System. It's an entity that we'll talk about in Chapter 16. But ultimately, any currency, if it's going to do its job well, has to follow these three functions in order to be legit. So looking at some characteristics that you saw in the video that you watched just prior to the PowerPoint, there's some characteristics of contemporary currency that we really have to follow through with. And we've been basically doing this since 1861 when the nation went on what was called then the U.S. greenback. Number one, our money has to be durable. And if you take a dollar bill and accidentally leave it in your pocket, you wash it in the washing machine, what you find is that it survives that whole process. Now, if it were paper, it would just fall apart like a receipt or a shopping list. So you know right away it's not made of paper. It's made of cotton and linen, and it's printed in such a way that you could fold it over 4,000 times before it would wear out. If you were to damage your cash, there is a redemption agency inside the Federal Reserve and the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, and they will redeem that currency if there's 51% of the bill there that they can identify. So the durability factor of the ink and the so-called paper that it's printed on, those all have to be part of the considerations of making a successful contemporary currency supply. Portability goes without saying that the Fed has been involved in digitizing or electronifying most of our transactions. I probably could poll the classroom right now and ask how many of you are actually carrying cash. Some of you might just be carrying debit cards or credit cards, right? The Fed has had a hand in making all of those transactions digital and making sure that we have maximized our portability so that markets can follow us anywhere. Divisibility. This is an interesting story that goes back to the history of the American dollar, a word basically that's not even English. It's derived from a German word for the Austrian form of currency, the Taler, Taler. Back during the era of the Revolution, the United States wanted to distinguish itself from its British pound, and they didn't want to say that word when they talked about American currency, so they went looking for something else. And the German Thaler seemed to be what the dollar was based off of. Still, we needed to trade with our British partners who had a currency based on the unit of 10 system. But to the south, we had the Spanish who used pieces of 8 and divided their bills, the peso, into quarters. So in order to accommodate trade from the beginning of our history, we've devised a way to divide up the dollar in several different ways. The more sensitive that your dollar is, being able to divide divide it down to the hundredths, the more accurate your pricing system is going to be. So while we may not see lots and lots of pennies in the future, we're still probably going to retain that as part of our accounting system because divisibility is important for currency. Uniformity. In terms of uniformity, even though we are printing new forms of the 150, you have to understand that people are going to expect to feel a certain texture, to see certain imagery, to see certain kinds of colors that they've been prepared to expect. Because uniformity and trust in the dollar is what gives it its value. If you print cash, like the Bureau of Engraving and Printing is able, with 13 different colors on the front and the back and overprinting, that might surprise people who would then second guess the value of the bill. So we have to keep our uniformity consistent over time. The greenback, as I mentioned before, is kind of the granddaddy of contemporary currency, and we've been using the same size of currency and the same kind of imagery and printing since the middle of the 19th century. So uniformity is key. Stability, this is probably, again, what we have the most challenge with, making sure that your dollar bears up in value over time. Of course, we're talking about price stability, and in some ways, that's going to be based off of what's going on in the economy at any given time. If inflation is a problem and veers into double-digit territory like it did back in 1979, that means the value of the dollar is sinking the longer that you hold it. So you really, in that situation, are probably better to use it quickly before it devalues anymore. And at that time, we saw people buying real estate. We saw people buying artworks. We saw people even investing in gold in order to protect their earned wealth. So that's kind of a miss or mistake of the market, or what you could say a market failure. So we want things to work efficiently with stable prices over the long haul. Now, I want to remind you guys, deflation from the video is not what we want to see. Falling prices do us no favors because people hoard their cash and wait for the wait for the markets to bottom out at the lowest prices. So you see a drop in consumption, a drop in production, and the economy begins to shrink. What we want to see is measured inflation that grows at a rate of about 2 or 3% a year. That way, it provides the proper incentive for people to innovate and look for profit opportunities in the future. That also guarantees that we're going to be able to manage our paper supply effectively, and we will be able to bear that value over time. So stability is key. Acceptability. I was surprised to find out in the video that over 2/3 of the nation's currency is not even here stateside. It's traded abroad. So that tells you how widely accepted the dollar bill is. Now, recently, we've basically had to compete with things like the euro. So there are other forms of currency out there that we constantly are checking to see how strong it is against the dollar. But at the moment, knock on wood, pretty much, we're able to basically use the dollar in transactions all over the world. So our contemporary currency meets all of these characteristics. Now, in terms of different types of money that you need to classify, you need to be familiar with commodity money. Commodity money is basically like bartering, where you are trading products, right, for other goods or services you can't create yourself. Commodity money from U.S. history might have been like tobacco leaves in the colony of Virginia that were stamped with a colony seal and considered tradable as cash in lieu of a currency that didn't exist yet. People could use them themselves, or they could trade them off for other things like eggs or food or whatever. And that basically is something that was used in the colonial era quite frequently, commodity money. Representative money, what we're saying there with that type of currency, we're saying that the paper that you're holding in your pocket is kind of like a receipt. You have that bill or that piece of paper representing value or wealth that's in a vault somewhere being protected. Nobody can claim your wealth unless they have the receipt. So the idea is that your bills represent gold or silver in a vault. Okay. That's kind of synonymous with the gold standard that we'll talk about shortly. Inconvertible fiat money is what we are on now. You saw in the video, that's what we've been on since the 1970s. Inconvertible just suggests the idea that you're not going to walk into a bank lay a $100 bill on the counter and get what is basically $100 worth of gold because it's not backed up by that. You can buy as much gold as you want on the gold market, but the idea is that those bills are independent of like a gold bullion or a silver bullion or anything that's being held by the Treasury. What's basically backing up the value is the mutual agreement that that's exchangeable between buyer and seller for goods and services. Fiat is a Roman word that means by government decree. And by government decree, the United States government has determined that we will be using the U.S. Federal Reserve note, which is the nation's legitimate form of currency. So, however much is in circulation will determine what the ultimate value is now. It's not backed up by gold or silver. To help you with these types of money terms, I've got some basic little cartoons here that might be helpful. If you're talking commodity money, what we're talking about is trade between people who have goods that they might barter with. If there are other services out in the economy that these farmers can't do for themselves, they might consider using other commodities to get those services for themselves. So this is something you're probably familiar with as bartering. Representative money basically involves gold on deposit locked up in a safe somewhere, as you can see in the diagram. Every piece of gold in the vault has a dollar that matches it. So it's kind of like something that limits the size of the money supply. If you basically want to lock the value of the bills to a unit of gold in the bank, that's exactly what we're talking about. So your money supply can't grow until you get more gold. That's when you print more bills, but you only print the bills that you have gold pieces for. So it can be kind of constraining on the size or how big your economy can grow. If you lose those gold reserves, then you have to lose the bills that go with them. So this is kind of like tying gold and silver to the dollar bill, representative cash. In the inconvertible fiat standard, it's kind of like you had those bills that were locked in their value to something that's on reserve in the bank. Here, we remove that lock and it becomes a paper currency that has to be managed. You can print as much of this stuff as the market will bear, but if you overprint it, then you devalue what each bill is capable of purchasing. So that's basically something that has to be managed carefully, and that's why we're going to be talking later about monetary policy. So that's as far as we'll get in the notes today. As long as you understand the characteristics of money, the durability and functions of money, along with the types of money that we've talked about, then you've got the big ideas that provide the takeaway for today. I'll visit with you more later next class, but now you're ready to start working on your homework.